Have you ever returned home to find your entire world turned upside down? That's exactly what happened to me, and let me tell you, it's a story you won't believe. Before we dive in, make sure you hit that subscribe button and notification bell, so you don't miss the other parts of this incredible journey. Trust me, what you're about to hear is just the beginning. The pine trees that lined Oakridge Trail used to give me a sense of peace whenever I returned home. My family's orchard had stood for over a century, rows of apple trees stretching across the rolling hills like nature's own masterpiece. My great-grandfather had planted the first sapling, and through depression, drought, and development, our land had remained a constant in an ever-changing world. That day in April, however, something felt different. I'd been away for 6 weeks on a consulting job in Tokyo, the kind of opportunity that comes once in a lifetime and pays enough to help an orchard survive another tough year. My wife, Ellie, had encouraged me to go. "The orchard will be here when you get back, Oliver," she'd said with that reassuring smile that had gotten me through countless hardships over our 15 years together. As my dusty pickup navigated the final curve of Oakridge Trail, the familiar view of my family's property should have appeared. Instead, I slammed on the brakes so hard my suitcase toppled from the passenger seat. Where acres of apple trees once stood, now rose a monstrous 3-story building with gleaming windows and landscaped gardens. Construction equipment still surrounded parts of the property, workers in hard hats milling about like busy insects. A massive sign proudly proclaimed, "Coming soon, the Pinecrest Retreat and Spa, luxury accommodations in the heart of nature." I sat there, knuckles white against the steering wheel, unable to process what I was seeing. This wasn't possible. This was my land that had been in my family for generations. Land that I had carefully maintained, that I had painstakingly documented and paid taxes on year after year. A construction worker approached my truck, clipboard in hand. "Can I help you, sir?" I stepped out, my legs unsteady beneath me. "What is this?" "This is my property. I'm Oliver Hayes." The worker's expression shifted from professional to uncomfortable in an instant. "Oh, Mr. Hayes, you might want to talk to Ms. Blackwell about that. She's handling all the, property questions." Victoria Blackwell, even hearing her name made my jaw clench. For 5 years, she'd been the president of the Pine Grove Estates Homeowners Association, ruling over our rural community with an iron fist disguised in designer clothing. She'd always viewed my orchard as an eyesore, a relic that didn't fit her vision of upscale country living. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from Ellie. "Oliver, emergency. Call me now." But I couldn't tear my eyes away from the monstrosity that had replaced my livelihood. This wasn't just a building, it was a theft of my heritage. I walked closer, my work boots crunching on gravel that had replaced fertile soil that had nurtured my family's trees for decades. Near the construction entrance, a bulletin board displayed various permits and notices. One caught my eye immediately. Pine Grove Community Development Project, approved by HOA Board, Director Victoria Blackwell. Next to it was a zoning document with the county seal, something about abandoned agricultural land and community enhancement initiatives. Abandoned? I'd been gone for 6 weeks, not 6 years. A stack of promotional materials sat on a nearby table. I picked one up, a glossy brochure showcasing the luxury retreat that was being built on my land. The language was flowery, talking about revitalizing underutilized spaces and bringing prosperity to Pine Grove. The construction worker was watching me nervously. "Sir, you really shouldn't be here without proper clearance." I offered a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "I'll be going now," I said, tucking the brochure into my jacket pocket, "but I'll be back." Driving into town, my mind raced through possibilities. How had this happened? What legal maneuvers had Victoria used? And most importantly, how could I fight back? A billboard along the highway proclaimed, "Pine Grove County, growing together for a brighter future." The irony wasn't lost on me. Growing together apparently meant taking what wasn't theirs. At Molly's Diner, the local gathering spot where gossip flowed as freely as the coffee, I settled into a corner booth and began making notes. Dates, observations, questions, each one a breadcrumb on the trail to understanding what had happened to my orchard. Molly herself brought over a mug of coffee, setting it down with the familiar clunk that had accompanied many of my morning breakfasts. "Heard about what happened, Oliver," she said, her voice low. "Not right, what they did." I looked up, surprised. "You know about this?" She nodded, glancing around before sliding into the seat across from me. "Victoria's been planning this for months. Keeps talking about how it'll put Pine Grove on the map. Most folks were afraid to speak up. You know how she can make life difficult for people who cross her. But how could she just take my land? I've got deeds, titles, everything." Molly shrugged. "All I know is she's been having lots of closed-door meetings with Commissioner Wallace. They're old college friends, you know." Commissioner Wallace, the county's head of zoning and development. Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. "Thanks, Molly," I said, leaving a generous tip as I headed out. My next stop was the old barn at the edge of my property, the one part of my land that appeared untouched by Victoria's resort plans. The barn had been my grandfather's sanctuary, and now it would be mine as I plotted my response to this theft. Inside, dust motes danced in the shafts of afternoon sunlight that penetrated the wooden slats. The air smelled of hay, old wood, and memories. Along the back wall stood my grandfather's massive oak filing cabinet, its surface worn smooth by decades of use. "Knowledge is power," he'd always told me, pointing to that cabinet. "Documentation is protection." I pulled open the heavy drawers, revealing meticulously organized folders. My grandfather, and later my father, had saved everything. Property surveys, tax records, correspondence with county officials, water rights documents, even weather. Records that tracked rainfall and growing conditions across decades. One folder in particular caught my eye. Labeled simply Boundaries, it contained surveys of our land dating back to 1948, each one notarized and official. I spread them across the workbench, studying the precise lines that defined our property. Something wasn't adding up. According to these surveys, our land extended nearly 15 acres beyond what I'd always considered the edge of our orchard, encompassing a natural spring that fed the entire valley's water table. I pulled out my phone and began photographing each document, my hands steady even as my mind raced with implications. The spring. This wasn't just about building a resort. There was something more at stake. A noise outside made me pause. The crunch of tires on gravel. Through the dusty window, I spotted a white luxury SUV pulling up to the property line. Victoria Blackwell emerged, her tailored pantsuit and perfect blonde bob as impeccable as always. She surveyed what used to be my orchard with the satisfied look of a conqueror assessing newly claimed territory. I stayed still in the shadows of the barn, watching as she walked the perimeter, making notes on her tablet. She paused at the spring, spending extra time examining the area before making a call on her cell phone. My own phone vibrated silently. A text from my old college roommate, Drew Zimmerman, now an environmental lawyer in the state capitol. Found something interesting in county water records. Call ASAP. Victoria finished her inspection and drove away, leaving me with more questions than answers. I waited until her SUV disappeared around the bend before emerging from the barn, clutching the folder of boundary surveys like a shield. The orchard, my orchard, looked like an alien landscape now. Construction equipment stood where century-old trees had once stretched toward the sky. My grandfather would have wept to see it. That evening, Ellie and I sat at our kitchen table, spreading out documents like battle plans. She'd been trying to reach me for days, ever since Victoria and her crew had shown up with bulldozers and official-looking paperwork. "They claimed you'd signed off on it," Ellie said, her voice tight with anger. "Showed me documents with your signature. I knew they were forgeries, but they had county stamps, notary seals. Everything looked official. And no one questioned. This not Sheriff Reeves or Judge Monroe." Ellie shook her head. "Victoria's network runs deep in this county. Anyone who might have helped was conveniently unavailable." I called Drew, putting him on speaker as we continued sorting through documents. "Oliver," his voice came through, confident and professional. "I've been looking into those water rights you mentioned. There's something fishy going on with the county records. The spring on your property feeds into the Pine Grove Reservoir, the main water source for the entire region." "And?" I prompted. "And there's been a proposal sitting with the State Water Board for months. A private company wants to bottle and sell that water. Guess who's the majority shareholder in that company?" "Victoria Blackwell," Ellie and I said in unison. "Bingo. But here's where it gets interesting. The proposal requires ownership of the land containing the spring. Your land." The pieces were falling into place. This wasn't just about a luxury resort. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Was just the visible part. The real prize was the water, an increasingly valuable resource in our drought-prone region. "What can we do?" I asked. "First, we document everything," Drew said. "I'll file emergency injunctions tomorrow morning, but we need to build a case. Victoria's been at this game a long time. She knows how to cover her tracks." After the call ended, Ellie squeezed my hand. "We'll fight this, Oliver. Your grandfather didn't raise you to back down." The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Harold Tucker, our 80-year-old neighbor, knocked on our door just after sunrise. His wrinkled hands clutched a weathered envelope. "Found this when I was cleaning out my attic," he said, his voice gravelly from decades of morning pipes. "Your grandfather gave it to my father for safekeeping back in the 60s. Said it might be important someday." Inside the envelope, yellowed with age, was a map unlike any I'd seen before. It detailed underground springs and waterways throughout the valley, with handwritten notes about flow rates and seasonal changes. But most importantly, it contained a legal covenant signed by all the original property owners in the valley, including Victoria's grandfather. The covenant explicitly protected the water rights of all signatory families, preventing any single owner from monopolizing the resource. It had been filed with the county, the state, and the federal land office, a triple layer of protection that even Victoria's connections couldn't easily overcome. "Your grandfather was a smart man," Harold said, accepting the cup of coffee Ellie offered, always thinking ahead. That afternoon, I visited Augustine Torres, the retired county clerk who had served Pine Grove for over 40 years before Victoria orchestrated his early retirement. I found him tending his garden, his hands still steady despite his 70-plus years. "I've been expecting you," he said simply, leading me to his home office. Victoria didn't think anyone would remember the old records, but I kept copies of everything. Augustine's meticulous record-keeping rivaled my grandfather's. He had documented years of subtle boundary changes, permit applications with irregularities, and most damning of all, evidence that Victoria had been quietly acquiring properties around the valley through various shell companies, all pointing toward her water bottling scheme. "She's been planning this for years," Augustine explained, showing me a progression of maps, bit by bit, changing records, updating plat maps, shifting boundaries by just a few feet with each new filing. Not enough to raise alarms, but over time, she created a new reality on paper, I finished, understanding dawning, one where my family's ownership could be questioned. Augustine nodded, but she made one critical mistake. She assumed No one was paying attention. By evening, my kitchen table had become command central. Drew had arrived from the capital, bringing legal expertise and connections to state officials. Ellie had reached out to community members, many of whom had their own stories of Victoria's manipulations and bullying tactics. A pattern emerged. Victoria had been systematically undermining property rights throughout Pine Grove, always under the guise of community improvement. The resort on my land was just the most visible example of her strategy. As darkness fell, I stepped outside for a moment of quiet reflection. The lights of the half-built resort glowed in the distance, a stark reminder of what we were fighting for. This wasn't just about land or water, it was about standing up to someone who believed rules didn't apply to them. My phone rang. An unknown number. "Mr. Hayes," a woman's voice, hushed and nervous. "My name is Rebecca Chen. I work in the County Records Office. We need to talk about Victoria Blackwell and what she's done to your property records." The battle was just beginning. But for the first time since seeing my orchard transformed into a construction site, I felt something more powerful than anger or despair. I felt hope. The County Records Office resembled a fortress of bureaucracy, fluorescent lights humming overhead, the scent of old paper and coffee lingering in the air. Rebecca Chen led me through a maze of filing cabinets to a small conference room in the back. "We need to be careful," she whispered, closing the door behind us. "Victoria has people everywhere." Rebecca's fingers trembled slightly as she pulled documents from her leather portfolio. "I've worked in records for 15 years. I've never seen manipulation like this." She spread several property maps across the table. "Look at these filings. For your orchard. Notice anything?" I examined the documents carefully. They appeared similar at first glance, but looking closer I spotted subtle differences. Boundary markers shifted by mere feet, easement notations altered. Even the property description language tweaked to introduce ambiguity. These changes were made incrementally over 3 years, Rebecca explained. Each minor enough to avoid scrutiny, but collectively. They create a legal gray area around my ownership, I finished, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. Rebecca nodded. "Victoria has been paying consultation fees to Deputy Clerk Wilson. He processes these changes without proper review." She pulled out one final document, a transfer of development rights that contained what appeared to be my signature. "This is forgery," I said immediately. "I never signed this." "I know," Rebecca replied. "The notary stamp belongs to Victoria's sister-in-law." I carefully photographed each document while Rebecca kept watch. "Why are you helping me?" I finally asked. She was quiet for a moment. "Victoria pulled the same tactics with my grandparents' restaurant downtown. By the time we realized what was happening, it was too late." Her eyes met mine. "Someone needs to stop her." Back at home, Drew examined the documents while Ellie organized our growing evidence wall. "This forgery is amateur work," Drew said, comparing the fake signature to my real one. "But combined with the boundary manipulations, it created enough confusion for Victoria to push through her permits." "But why now?" Ellie asked. "Victoria's been president for 5 years. Why suddenly move on our land?" Drew pulled up emails from his environmental contacts. "Water rights. The state is revising watershed protections next month. Once those go into effect, her bottling operation would face much stricter regulations. So she needed to secure ownership before the new rules," I said, the timeline finally making sense. A knock at the door interrupted us. Sheriff Reeves stood on our porch, his expression grim beneath his grey mustache. "Oliver, I've got papers here. Victoria Blackwell has filed a restraining order. You're to stay 500 feet from the construction site." I accepted the papers wordlessly. Sheriff Reeves, who'd fished with my grandfather for 30 years, couldn't meet my eyes. Just doing my job, he murmured. I know, Bill, I said, but someone should be asking why Victoria's building on land that isn't hers. His gaze flickered to mine briefly. Funny thing about that construction site, County Environmental Inspector is scheduled to visit tomorrow morning. Standard procedure, of course. He adjusted his hat. Inspector Jenkins is thorough, very thorough. After he left, Drew grinned. Sounds like not everyone is in Victoria's pocket. The next morning, we watched from a distance as a county vehicle pulled up to the construction site. Inspector Jenkins, a tall woman with practical boots and a clipboard, spent hours examining the property, paying particular attention to the spring area. By afternoon, work at the site had stopped. A red violation notice was posted at the entrance. Victoria's response was swift. By evening, a team of lawyers had secured a temporary lift on the work stoppage, claiming economic hardship and promised remediation measures. Construction resumed the following day. She's playing hardball, Drew observed, but so can we. That weekend, we organized a community meeting at the Pine Grove Grange Hall. I expected a handful of neighbors. Instead, nearly 100 people showed up, many with their own stories of Victoria's machinations. Marcel Garcia, who owned the local nursery, described how Victoria had manipulated easement rights to block his planned expansion. Sophia Williams, a retired schoolteacher, explained how her property had been rezoned without notice, doubling her property taxes overnight. Victoria doesn't just bend rules, Augustine Torres told the crowd. She's created a system where she makes the rules. One by one, community members shared their experiences, each story reinforcing the pattern of manipulation, intimidation, and selective enforcement that had become Victoria's hallmark. When everyone had spoken, I stood. This isn't just about my orchard, I said. It's about our community. Victoria thinks we'll stay silent because she's powerful. She thinks we'll back down because fighting is hard. I looked around the room, meeting the eyes of my neighbors. She's wrong. The gathering became a strategic planning session. Retired attorney Jim Parker offered legal advice. Local journalist May Lynn promised investigative coverage. Even Commissioner Wallace's administrative assistant anonymously provided internal emails showing Victoria's undue influence. As the meeting concluded, Harold Tucker approached with several other elderly residents. We've been in Pine Grove longer than Victoria's been alive, he said. We remember when her grandfather tried similar tactics in the 60s. Got shut down then. Time to remind the Blackwells that history repeats itself. The following morning, Victoria arrived at the construction site to find 24 community members with signs protesting the illegal resort. Local news cameras captured everything, including Victoria's barely contained fury. "This is private property," she shouted, her perfectly composed facade cracking. "You're trespassing." "Actually," Drew replied calmly, legal documents in hand, "according to county records predating your recent manipulations, this gathering is occurring on the public easement." Victoria's eyes narrowed. "You're making a mistake, Oliver. I have connections you can't imagine." "So do I replied. "They're standing all around you." The community protest made regional news. By evening, the story had caught the attention of state officials, including the Attorney General's office, which announced it would review the permitting process for the resort project. Victoria counterattacked through bureaucratic channels. Citations for code violations suddenly appeared for supporters of our cause. Tax reassessments were initiated. Permit applications languished. "She's getting desperate," Drew observed as we reviewed our legal strategy. "That's when people make mistakes." Victoria's mistake came from an unexpected direction. The County Water Authority, responding to concerns raised by Inspector Jenkins, conducted tests at the spring. The results revealed contaminants leaching from the resort's foundation, chemicals that threatened the entire valley's water supply. State environmental officials immediately issued a stop work order that not even Victoria's connections could overcome. The following day, Victoria called an emergency HOA meeting. The community centre buzzed with tension as I entered with Drew, Ellie, and a dozen supporters. Victoria sat at the centre table, flanked by her board members and legal team. Her expression remained confident, but I noticed the slight tremble in her hands as she arranged her papers. This emergency meeting will address the temporary construction delay at the Pinecrest Retreat, she began, her voice carrying the practiced authority that had intimidated so many for so long. I raised my hand immediately. Victoria's jaw tightened, but with cameras present, she acknowledged me. "Before we discuss the delay," I said, rising from my seat, "I'd like to address the underlying issue. The construction is occurring on property that was illegally acquired through document manipulation, forged signatures, and abuse of HOA authority." Victoria's attorney intervened. "Mr. Hayes, these are serious allegations without foundation." "I have foundation," I replied, nodding to Drew, who distributed packets to each board member. "These documents show the systematic alteration of property records over 3 years, culminating in a fraudulent transfer bearing a forged signature." The room erupted in murmurs. Board member Thomas Nielsen examined the evidence with growing concern. "Is this accurate, Victoria? Did you authorize these changes?" Victoria maintained her composure. "These allegations are preposterous. The property transfer was entirely legal, including this notarization by your sister-in-law of a signature made while I was verifiably out of the country," I asked, displaying my passport stamps alongside the fraudulent document. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Victoria's face. Board members exchanged nervous glances. "Furthermore," Drew added, rising to stand beside me, "we have testimony from county employees documenting Ms. Blackwell's direction to alter official records. The State Attorney General has been provided with this evidence." Victoria's attorney whispered urgently in her ear. Her knuckles whitened around her pen. I continued, "Beyond the property theft, there's the matter of the spring and the water rights. Documents filed with the State Water Board reveal Ms. Blackwell's company, Clearwater Bottling, planned to extract and commercialize water from my property, water protected by a covenant dating back to 1952. I displayed the covenant Harold had provided the signatures of all original property owners, including Victoria's grandfather, clear and legally binding. "This isn't just about my orchard," I told the suddenly attentive board. "It's about Victoria using her position to systematically undermine property rights throughout Pinegrove for personal gain." Victoria stood abruptly. "This meeting is adjourned, pending legal consultation." "Actually," Thomas Nielsen said, "I move that we continue this discussion and examine these allegations thoroughly." Other board members nodded in agreement. Victoria's carefully constructed power base was crumbling before her eyes. Outside afterward, Rebecca Chen approached me. "There's something else you should know," she said quietly. "Victoria's resort project isn't fully funded. She's leveraged everything on getting that water bottling operation approved before the new regulations." This explained Victoria's reckless push forward despite mounting obstacles. She wasn't just fighting for a project, she was fighting financial ruin. That night, as Ellie and I walked our property, examining the half-built resort that had replaced generations of carefully tended apple trees, she squeezed my hand. "Your grandfather would be proud. He always said the land would protect those who protected it." In the distance, the spring continued its eternal flow, water bubbling from deep within the earth, water that had sustained our community for generations, water that Victoria had tried to claim for herself. "This isn't over," I said, watching. "The sunset paint the construction site in golden light." "Victoria won't give up easily," Ellie smiled. "Neither will we." The next morning brought news that the State Attorney General had opened a formal investigation into Victoria's activities. By afternoon, 2 county officials had resigned. Victoria herself was nowhere to be found. Her house dark, her office empty. Drew called with updates from his legal contacts. The HOA board has called an emergency session to distance themselves from Victoria. They're falling over themselves to cooperate with investigators. The tide had turned. Victoria had believed her power made her untouchable. She'd believed her connections would protect her. Most of all, she'd believed no one would fight back. She was wrong on all counts. As Inspector Jenkins conducted another examination of the spring area, she waved me over. "Mr. Hayes, we've determined these foundation chemicals could have permanently contaminated the watershed. You might have saved the valley's water supply." I looked at the half-built structure, concrete and steel where apple trees should be, standing. The fight to reclaim my land was far from over. There would be court battles, restoration challenges, years of work to heal what had been damaged. But as neighbors stopped by with encouragement, as community members volunteered assistance, as old-timers shared stories of my grandfather's foresight, I knew one thing with certainty: we would prevail. Victoria had built her empire on manipulation and fear. We would rebuild our community on transparency and cooperation, and one day, apple trees would again grow where her hotel now stood. The courthouse steps gleamed in the morning sunlight as I straightened my tie. After months of preparation, today would decide everything. Inside, the polished wooden benches were packed with Pine Grove residents. Victoria sat across the aisle, her usual confidence replaced by barely concealed anxiety. Judge Eleanor Ramirez entered, her reputation for fairness preceding her. "Dean, this court will now hear Hayes versus Blackwell and the Pine Grove Estates HOA," she announced. Unlike the county officials Victoria had manipulated, Judge Ramirez had no connections to local politics. Our attorney presented the evidence methodically. The forged documents, testimony from Rebecca Chen, environmental reports, and most damning, the recently discovered emails between Victoria and Commissioner Wallace detailing their scheme. Victoria's defense crumbled under cross-examination when confronted with her own words. The technical questions about water rights and property boundaries gave way to the simpler issue of fraud. By midday, her own attorney looked defeated. Judge Ramirez's ruling was unequivocal. "The court finds clear evidence of document falsification, abuse of authority, and fraudulent property transfer," she declared. "Construction will cease immediately, and the land will be returned to Mr. Hayes with damages for lost revenue and restoration costs." Victoria's criminal trial came 3 months later. The investigation had uncovered similar schemes throughout the county, affecting dozens of properties. Her network of corrupt officials had disintegrated, each rushing to cooperate in exchange for leniency. Standing on my property the following spring, I watched as the partially built resort was dismantled. Environmental teams worked carefully to remove the contaminated foundation, preserving the spring that had nearly been destroyed. Ellie joined me, carrying seedlings from our greenhouse. "First new trees," she said, handing me a young apple sapling. Together we planted it where the hotel lobby had stood, the first of hundreds that would eventually restore our orchard. The HOA underwent a complete restructuring. Thomas Nielsen led a reform movement focused on transparency and actual community improvement. New bylaws prevented the concentration of power that had allowed Victoria's abuses. Augustine Torres became the unofficial historian, documenting the case to ensure such manipulation could never happen again. Rebecca Chen received a promotion to head the newly created Records Integrity Department at the county. One afternoon, as I worked in the restored section of the orchard, Harold Tucker visited. Your grandfather always said the land knows who truly owns it, he remarked, examining a flourishing sapling. Looks like he was right. The water from our spring remained protected under the original covenant, strengthened by new state regulations. Rather than becoming bottled for profit, it continued nourishing the valley as it had for generations. The final apple tree was planted exactly 1 year after the court decision, marking not just the restoration of our orchard, but the healing of our community. What Victoria had intended as my loss had become a victory far greater than just reclaiming land. It had revealed the power of documentation, persistence, and neighbors standing together against those who abuse their authority. As autumn brought our first small harvest, I realized my grandfather's legacy wasn't just in the land or trees, but in the lesson he'd taught through his meticulous record-keeping. Always be prepared for those who might try to take what isn't theirs. They just might fall into a legal trap of your own making. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.